Chapter 18, the heart. This is our second of 3 chapters that will cover the cardiovascular system. All right, we're going to start by talking about heart anatomy, and really we're going to talk gross anatomy first. When we talk about the size of the heart is approximately the size of your fist and typically weighs less than a pound. The location of the heart, it is enclosed in the mediastinum. Remember, that is the medial subdivision of the thoracic cavity. And the heart extends obliquely for about 5 inches from about the second rib to the fifth intercostal space. It rests on the superior aspect of your diaphragm, and it is anterior to the vertebral column and posterior to your sternum. When we look at orientation, we can say that the heart is about 2/3 to the left of the midline of the body, and its apex, put that term up here, its apex, the inferior tip of the heart, points to the left. We can see from these diagrams here exactly the location and orientation that we were talking about. If we use this diagram first, we can see that indeed they've drawn this mid-sternal line, and the heart is more to the left of that mid-sternal line. We can also see it begins at about that second rib, ends at about that fifth intercostal space here. It is behind the sternum, yet in front of the vertebral column. And then finally, this larger diagram here, the apex, that tip points left. It rests on the superior aspect of the diaphragm, and indeed, it is in that mediastinum. Your heart has several protective coverings that surround it. And the protective coverings of the heart are called the pericardium. The pericardium is defined as a double-walled sac around the heart. And if you heard me correctly, you heard a double-walled sac. So here are the 2 walls of that making up the pericardium. The first is called the fibrous pericardium. This is the superficial layer. It is considered a loosely fitting part of that sac, and as its name implies, it is very tough and durable. This layer has several functions, okay? It protects and anchors the heart to its surroundings. It prevents overfilling of the heart, and it allows the heart to work in a relatively friction-free environment. The second of those 2 layers of the pericardium is what we call the serous pericardium. And so this is the serous membrane that we learned about in A&P 1. The serous pericardium is deep to the fibrous pericardium. It is thin and slippery like every serous membrane. And again, like every serous membrane, it is composed of 2 continuous layers. The 2 continuous layers always include the parietal layer and a visceral layer. The parietal layer lines the internal surface of the fibrous pericardium, and the visceral layer has an alternate name called the epicardium. This covers the external wall of the heart and is actually considered an important part of the heart wall. Now, between these 2 layers, there always is a space that's filled with that serous fluid. And I just want to remind you that that serous fluid is very important because it helps lubricate between those 2 layers so that every time your heart contracts, it can contract in a relatively friction-free environment. The last term that you see up here is pericarditis. And if you see this itis on the end of a word, it's always going to indicate inflammation. Okay, so pericarditis is inflammation of the pericardium, usually due to a bacterial pneumonia. So if we look at this picture, we're taking this little part, we're blowing it up so we can see it better. We can see here is the fibrous pericardium. Deep to it is the parietal layer of the serous pericardium. Continuing here, once we get over the heart surface, now we have the visceral layer or epicardium, and then this space here is called the pericardial cavity and would be filled with serous fluid. Now we're going to refer back to this picture again in just a moment. We're going to go learn the parts of the heart wall. All right, once again, we have that outermost layer of the heart wall, the epicardium. This thick layer that we see here is the muscular myocardium, and then lining the interior chambers, we have endocardium. 3 layers to the heart wall, okay? One we've already talked about, epicardium. This is the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. And this is a layer that usually shows the presence of some adipose or fat. The myocardium, this is the middle layer. Its prefix here, myo, tells us that it is composed of muscle, and it is composed of cardiac muscle tissue. And it is responsible for the pumping action or contraction of the heart. The innermost layer of the heart wall is called the endocardium, and this is composed of a shiny sheet of endothelium. If you remember to A&P1 or any other class you had that may have discussed this, endothelium is just a specialized type of simple squamous epithelium, so it's very thin, very slick, very shiny, and this endothelium lines all the internal surfaces of the heart. Okay, so we find this lining the chambers of the heart and the internal surface of the heart. This endothelium, we're going to learn next chapter, also continues out with those blood vessels. All right, we're going to go back to our previous slide to see these 3 layers. The human heart is made up of chambers, okay? There are 4 chambers to the human heart. We have 2 upper chambers and 2 lower chambers. The upper chambers are referred to as atria. Okay, so these are the superior chambers of the heart. They are often referred to as receiving chambers, and they are divided into right and left based on their location. And so we have the right atrium and the left atrium, and these are separated by a dividing wall called the interatrial septum. Now, every time you see the word septum, I want you to think of wall or divider, okay? The lower or inferior chambers are called the ventricles, okay? And they are often referred to as pumping chambers. And of course, based on their location, we have the right ventricle and we have the left ventricle. And between the two is a very thick interventricular septum. Okay, so again, that's the wall between the ventricles. And it's very thick. We'll see this on diagrams. Now, when it comes to the external features of the heart, we're going to learn a few grooves that exist on the outer surface of the heart. Now, these grooves, sometimes referred to as sulci, or sulcus is one, are created by blood vessels that surround the external heart. The first one that we're going to talk about is called the atrioventricular groove, also called the coronary sulcus, okay? The atrioventricular groove or coronary sulcus is the groove on the heart surface that is found between the atria and ventricles. So it encircles the heart going between those superior atria and the inferior ventricles. The next one we're going to note is the anterior interventricular sulcus. So this name sort of tells us where we find it. Anterior is on the front, interventricular between the ventricles, and sulcus means groove. So this is a groove on the anterior surface of the heart running between the ventricles. Our third is sort of the opposite of that one. The posterior interventricular sulcus is a groove on the posterior aspect of the heart between the ventricles. So we can't actually see the grooves because the blood vessels are in this picture, but I can show you where those grooves would be found. So the AV groove would go all the way around. Of course, it's not out here, but would be here, and then on the back of the heart. The anterior interventricular sulcus would be beneath these vessels here. And on this slide, the posterior interventricular sulcus would be here. And by the way, here's the continuation of that coronary sulcus or AV groove. All right, let's learn some more about those atria, okay? The atria we already mentioned are often referred to as receiving chambers. We also said that they are the superior chambers of the heart. But now I want to tell you that they are the smaller and thinner walled chambers as we compare those to the ventricles. They have less muscular content than the ventricles. They really only contribute minimally to the pumping action of the heart. And we want to point out a few anatomical features of the atria, okay? The first feature that I want to point out to you are what are called auricles. Now the word auricle is the Latin word for ear, okay? And the reason we call these auricles is they look like small, wrinkled, ear-like appendages that we see on the external surface of the atria. Now we believe that these auricles slightly increase the atrial volume. The next thing I want to talk about are the pectinate muscles. The pectinate muscles are the irregular ridges of muscles in the walls of the atria. Next, the fossa ovalis. The fossa ovalis is a small depression in the interatrial septum that began as a hole. And remember in anatomy that holes are referred to as foramen or foramen. Well, this began as what's called the foramen ovale. And it was a hole between the right and left atria. And this allows for the fetal lungs to be bypassed when the fetus is developing in utero. We'll talk about this more at the end of this chapter. And then a term that we've already talked about when it comes to the atria is that interatrial septum. This is the very thin wall that separates the right atrium from the left atrium. Now, what is the function of those atria? The function is to receive blood from the circulation. Important vessels of the atria are actually entering. So I'm going to add a word here, important vessels entering. This will just help you remember this later, entering the atria. We actually have 3 vessels that enter the right atrium, and we have 4 vessels that enter the left atrium, okay? So, entering the right atrium, the first we're going to talk about is the superior vena cava, often abbreviated SVC. The superior vena cava returns blood from body regions superior to the diaphragm. The inferior vena cava, often abbreviated IVC, returns blood from body regions below the diaphragm. And finally, the coronary sinus collects blood draining from the heart muscle or myocardium and returns it to the right atrium. Now, entering the left atrium, we actually have 4 pulmonary veins, okay? 4 of these. We have 2 right and 2 left pulmonary veins. And these pulmonary veins transport oxygen-rich blood from the lungs to the left atrium. All right, let's look at our diagram of the internal heart using a frontal section here. So we've removed the front of the heart. You're looking into it. Here is our right atrium. Okay, we can see that fossa ovalis here, this little depression. Here is the left atrium. Okay, we can kind of see, let me erase here for a second. We can see these pectinate muscles, those irregular ridges that we're showing here. Now we cannot see in this view that interatrial septum, but it is there, okay? It would be behind these vessels that we're seeing here. Now, entering the right atrium, we have the superior vena cava. We have the inferior vena cava that we can see in this view. We can't see the coronary sinus in this view, but that's okay. And then entering the left atrium, we have these two left pulmonary veins and these two right pulmonary veins. Now just keep in mind, these right ones are going to go behind this heart and they actually enter this chamber right here, okay? I'll show you that on a posterior view. And I will show you that posterior view in just a moment. Let's talk about the ventricles. As we said, the ventricles are the inferior chambers, okay? They are often referred to as pumping chambers, okay? And that is because they are responsible for the pumping action of the heart. The walls of the ventricles are very thick, and the chambers are much larger than those of the atria. The ventricles make up the majority of heart volume. The right ventricle forms most of the heart's anterior surface, while the left ventricle forms most of the heart's postero-inferior surface. So what anatomical features do we see with ventricles? All right, we see what are called trabeculi carnii. Trabeculi carnii are the large irregular ridges of muscles on the internal surface of the ventricles, okay? Now they're going to rise up, smooth out, and they're going to become papillary muscles. The word papilla, every time we see that in anatomy, you're going to think nipple or cone shape. And these papillary muscles are cone-shaped muscles that arise from the trabeculi carnii, and then they are going to attach to our neck structure here called chordae tendineae, and they play an important role in heart valve function. So what are these chordae tendineae then? This term, chordae tendineae, translates into cord-like tendons, okay? And so commonly they are referred to as your heart strings. These chordae tendineae are cord-like or string-like structures that go between the papillary muscles inferiorly. They attach to the AV valves superiorly and are involved in AV valve function. We'll talk all about the valves in just a little bit. The last one is a reminder of a term we just talked about, the interventricular septum. The interventricular septum is a thick dividing wall between the right and left ventricles. Now, how about the function of the ventricles? They pump blood out of the they pump blood out of the heart into the body or circulatory system. Now here we see a picture of a cross section through the heart. This would be a horizontal section through it. You can see that this is the right ventricle. This is the right ventricular wall. See how it's thin? This is the left ventricle, and this is the left ventricular wall. Notice its thickness. We'll talk about the difference in that in just a moment. And so what you see on this interior portion would be that interventricular septum. Let's talk about the important vessels of the ventricle, and these are exiting. So important vessels exiting the ventricles. Here we talk about just two, one exiting each ventricle. And the first one we talk about exits the right ventricle. It is the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk exits the right ventricle. It's going to quickly divide into right and left pulmonary arteries. And it's going to carry oxygen-poor blood to the lungs where it can pick up oxygen. Exiting the left ventricle is the largest vessel in the body, called the aorta. And the aorta is responsible for carrying oxygenated blood to all body regions. And what we're going to learn next chapter is all arteries actually begin as this single large vessel called the aorta. All right, let's look at this view where we can see the external surface of the heart in anterior view. All right, so I'm going to change colors here. Here we see the right ventricle. Here we see the left ventricle. This is the pulmonary trunk just until it divides. Okay, pulmonary trunk. Okay, as soon as it divides, we have the left pulmonary artery and we have the right pulmonary artery. And then exiting the left ventricle, here we have the aorta. And it's going to give off, I just spelled that wrong, aorta. Aorta. And it's going to give off these branches here, and they're going to carry blood to the rest of the body. All right, I want to go back to our internal view of the heart. Let me see if I can go forward first. All right, so let's talk about those valves. When we talk about heart valves, the human heart has 4 valves that we're going to learn about. But let's talk about the purpose or function of these valves before we specifically talk about the valves themselves. Heart valves have a very, very important function, and that is to ensure a one-way flow of blood through the heart. We have 2 types of valves. We have atrioventricular or AV valves, and we have semilunar valves or SL valves. Just some general information about those AV valves. The AV valves are found between the atria and the ventricles. They prevent the backflow of blood into the atria when the ventricles contract, and they are attached to those chordae tendineae, which those chordae tendineae attach to the papillary muscles, and that controls their closure. There are 2 AV valves, okay? We have the tricuspid valve. The tricuspid valve is found between the right atrium and right ventricle. It gets its name tricuspid because it has 3 cusps or flaps. The second AV valve is commonly referred to as the mitral valve. I'm going to try to use this more often than bicuspid because clinically we talk mitral a lot more often. Bicuspid because it has 2 flaps or cusps. But the mitral valve is located between the left atrium and the left ventricle. Now both of these valves close when the ventricles contract. And again, that's to prevent that blood from re-entering those superior atria. All right, our second type of heart valve, the semilunar valves. Semilunar valves, general information, they guard the openings of the large arteries exiting the ventricles, and they open and close based on pressure changes that occur in the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. So, 2 valves to talk about here. The first is the aortic valve. It is found at the opening of the aorta. Okay? Second one is the pulmonary valve, found at the opening of the pulmonary trunk. Okay, we'll use this picture and let's look at those chambers and the internal structure. So what we see here, this is right ventricle. All of this is left ventricle. This is that interventricular septum. Okay, these ridges that we see here, these are the trabeculi carnii. And then they're going to rise up to make these cone shapes, very large cone shapes, papillary muscles. Can you guys see the chordae tendineae here in white? Cords. And they're going to attach to these valves, which we're just going to start learning about now. All right, where are these valves? I'm going to change my color here. I'm going to do green. All right, here, this white shiny, okay, this that I'm coloring is the tricuspid valve. Okay, over here is the mitral valve, coloring it in green. Okay, now semilunar valves, the main way to do this is locate and name the trunk. So this is pulmonary trunk. This is aorta. So we have to find their valves. I'm going to do some erasing, guys. Gosh. All right, so here, this is the pulmonary valve, okay, see at the opening of the pulmonary trunk, and this here is the aortic valve at the opening of the aorta. All right, so for the most part, when we talk about oxygenated blood, we denote that using a red pencil, red vessels. When we're talking about deoxygenated blood, we denote that using blue. So if you follow along with that flow chart, what we see is that blood enters this right atrium through the superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and coronary sinus. It then goes past the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. From there, it's going to go through the open pulmonary valve, into the pulmonary trunk, out of those pulmonary arteries to the lungs. Okay? Now, we're going to pick up oxygen, so we're going to change to red. Oxygen-rich blood is going to go through the 4 pulmonary veins into the left atrium, through the open mitral valve into the left ventricle, through the open aortic valve into the aorta, where it will travel to the entire body. Okay? Love this view here. We can actually, this is a superior view of the heart. You can see very easily the 3 cusps of the tricuspid, the 2 cusps of the bicuspid or mitral. And then notice the semilunar valves look the same from above. They have kind of these cup-shaped, 3 cup-shaped structures. Here's the pulmonary valve, here's the aortic valve. This is also a beautiful picture of those chordae tendineae. This is actually in a human heart. See those nice strings? You can also see them very well here and here. There's that very thick interventricular septum. Now I just want to spend a minute here talking about how these valves function. They're very different. Again, the AV valves rely upon the papillary muscles and the chordae tendineae in order to snap shut and to open. And you can see here that that explains that. Whereas, as I mentioned, the semilunar valves rely on changes in pressure. And so we need to change the slide here. The semilunar valves rely on change in pressure. So when the ventricles contract, they generate a great deal of pressure. They force that blood out of the heart. And as blood exits the heart, pressure out here is high, pressure in here is much lower, and so the blood tries to flow backwards. Well, when it flows backward, it catches the cup shapes of these semilunar valves, and the blood fills it and will cause it to close. So no chordae tendineae there, no papillary muscles, just the sheer physics of blood flow. All right, our next topic that we want to talk about is blood flow through the heart. But before we talk specifically of blood flow through the heart, we want to define that there are two distinct circulatory pathways. The first one we're going to talk about is called the pulmonary circuit. Now, I could also say pulmonary circulation. Now, the reason that we have two circulatory pathways is this, and this is important for you guys to hear, listen, and maybe write down. The heart is actually two separate pumps that work side by side simultaneously. Those two separate pumps are what give the pumping action to these specific circulatory pathways. So, our first one is the pulmonary circuit. When you see pulmonary, I want you to think lungs, okay? And so the pulmonary circuit includes blood vessels that carry blood to and from the lungs. It relies on the right side of the heart as its pump. It is a short, low pressure circulatory pathway, and this is where gas exchange occurs. Our second circulatory pathway is the systemic circuit. And systemic, I want you to always think of as body-wide. And the systemic circuit includes blood vessels that carry blood to and from all body tissues. It relies on the left ventricle as its pump. It is a long pathway, and it is going to encounter a great deal of friction as it tries to distribute blood to all tissues. That's your pulmonary circuit. Now, excuse the way this comes into this program. You guys have your own PowerPoints that you can see this very clearly. But this is a flow chart that shows you the blood flow through the heart. Now, this is definitely something I want you to learn, okay? It will be reflected on the exam. You will be asked to show blood flow through the heart. So we're going to use this step by step. And then I'm going to actually show you on a heart, okay? So here's what we see. We pick a spot, and by the way, this really should be a cycle that continues, but I don't have enough room on here to actually do that. So deoxygenated blood enters the right atrium through the superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and coronary sinus. It's going to travel through the tricuspid valve and then enter the right ventricle. It will then flow through the pulmonary valve to enter the pulmonary trunk, okay? The pulmonary trunk, I didn't put this here, but it divides into right and left pulmonary arteries, which goes to the lungs for oxygen, okay? Now, oxygenated blood is going to return to the left atrium through those four pulmonary veins. It will go through the bicuspid valve or mitral valve into the left ventricle. It will go through the aortic valve, and it will enter the aorta, and the aorta will deliver the oxygenated blood to the entire body. And this cycle will continue over and over and over again. Here it is kind of step by step in a picture, but I want to show it to you. I want to show you this one. I want to show you this view first. Pulmonary circuit up here, systemic circuit here. This is showing you blood flow through the heart, but I'm going to draw it on a heart, if I can get the picture just a second. All right, the last anatomical topic that we're going to talk about in this video is the coronary circulation. Now, the coronary circulation is a specialized circulatory pathway that supplies the functional blood to the heart muscle itself. Even though the heart's filled with blood day in, day out, that's not the blood that actually nourishes the heart muscle. That comes through this coronary circulation. So when we talk about the coronary circulation, of course, it's going to involve both arterial supply, that we're going to talk about on this slide, and then venous drainage that we're going to talk about on a subsequent slide. So the arterial supply, these all branch from the aorta, and we have the two major branches, being the right coronary artery, the left coronary artery, and the right coronary artery. And so when we talk about these two vessels, here's what we know. Again, they both arise from the aorta, and they encircle the heart in that atrioventricular groove. The left coronary artery will branch to become the anterior interventricular artery, okay? And that's going to be found in that anterior interventricular sulcus on the front of the heart. And then its other main branch is the circumflex artery. The circumflex artery is going to be the one that supplies the left atrium and posterior walls of the left ventricle. This one supplies the anterior walls of the ventricles. Now, the right coronary artery also gives off two main branches. The marginal artery, which supplies the lateral part of the right side of the heart, and the posterior interventricular artery, found in that posterior interventricular sulcus. It's going to run to the apex of the heart, and it supplies the posterior ventricular walls. We can see those isolated here in this diagram. Here is that left coronary artery. Here is the circumflex. It's going to go all the way back here. Here is that anterior interventricular artery running down the front surface. Here is that right coronary artery. Okay, here is the right marginal artery, and then shaded because it's on the back, here is that posterior interventricular artery. The venous drainage of that coronary circulation consists of three vessels that fuse to form a larger vessel that we've talked about already called the coronary sinus. So important to understand is that veins start small and they merge and get bigger, and that's what we're seeing here. So if we look at this, we have the coronary sinus, which is formed by the union of the great, middle, and small cardiac veins that will empty that deoxygenated blood into the right atrium. So where do we find these cardiac veins? The great cardiac vein is found along with the anterior interventricular artery. Middle cardiac vein is found along with the posterior interventricular artery. And the small cardiac vein runs along with the marginal artery. Let's look at those. All right, there's that very large coronary sinus. Again, it's on the posterior aspect. It's going to empty into this right atrium. Here's that great cardiac vein. I'm drawing an arrow alongside of it. Here's the small cardiac vein along with the marginal. And then on the posterior aspect here is that middle cardiac vein. Now, what happens if you have blockage of anything in that coronary circulation? Well, if you have blood supply blocked to the heart muscle itself, you're going to have problems. And one of the first things you might experience is something called angina pectoris. And this is the chest or thoracic pain due to decreased blood delivery to the heart muscle or myocardium. Now, prolonged blockage of that might lead to a myocardial infarction that we often call an MI, or we commonly call a heart attack. So a heart attack is due to prolonged coronary blockage. Now, when we talk about heart attacks, it's important to understand that the severity of a heart attack depends on where the blockage occurs. If we look back and understand that that left ventricle is responsible for pumping blood into the entire circulation through the aorta, any blockage that would damage the left ventricle would be a severe myocardial infarction. It would diminish the pumping action of the heart. So that's the worst place to have blockage too. Remember how I showed you the thickness of that ventricular wall of the left side is much thicker, and that's because it has to generate so much more force to eject blood into the entire circulatory pathway. The problem after you have had prolonged blockage is you've killed off those cardiac muscle cells, and they do not replace with more contractile cardiac muscle cells. They actually replace with scar tissue, again, which diminishes the pumping action of the heart.